Racist cop harasses black U.S. Army general, faces immediate consequences. The wind carried an uncomfortable tension as Sergeant Frank Mills stood by his patrol car in the quiet neighborhood of Cedar Grove. The sky was a muted gray, and the streets were eerily empty, as if the suburban homes around him sensed that something was about to happen. He adjusted his sunglasses and scanned the street for any sign of movement. There was nothing unusual about the day, except that he felt a restless energy thrumming in his veins, and he couldn't quite shake it. As Mills stood there, his radio crackled to life with the dispatcher's voice. "Unit 7, we have reports of a suspicious vehicle near Pinecrest Avenue. Dark sedan. Please check it out." Mills sighed. Cedar Grove was a peaceful neighborhood, mostly white, and rarely did anything happen that required much of his attention. A suspicious vehicle could mean anything, but the request didn't come as a surprise. Too often, the residents in this area got uneasy whenever a car they didn't recognize was parked for too long. He slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition, the patrol car rumbling to life. As he pulled out of his spot and onto Pinecrest, he spotted the car in question almost immediately, a sleek black sedan parked on the side of the road. The engine was off, and the driver appeared to be sitting inside. Mills narrowed his eyes as he drove up slowly, pulling over just a few feet behind the vehicle. His mind immediately wandered to thoughts he wouldn't admit out loud. What kind of person would drive such a car around here? When he approached the sedan, the glint of a military bumper sticker caught his eye. The sticker was small but noticeable, displaying the U.S. Army insignia in bold colors. He adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his authority on his hips as he got out of the patrol car. As he approached the sedan, he caught a glimpse of the driver through the window. A tall, imposing black man dressed in civilian clothes, wearing dark aviator sunglasses. The man seemed calm, focused, perhaps unaware that he was being scrutinized. Mills knocked on the window with the back of his knuckles, his face tight, and his posture exuding authority. The man inside glanced at him, paused, then slowly rolled down the window. "Yes, officer?" the man asked, his voice calm and steady. "What are you doing around here?" Mills asked curtly, skipping the pleasantries. His eyes flicked up and down the man's face, looking for any sign of nervousness or guilt, but finding none. The man raised an eyebrow. "I'm parked, waiting to pick someone up." "Who are you picking up?" Mills' tone was sharp, demanding. The man paused for a moment, seemingly considering whether or not he needed to answer the question. He finally responded, "My daughter." Mills's lips tightened. He hated that the man wasn't rattled, that he wasn't playing into the power dynamic Mills had come to expect in situations like these. The officer shifted his weight slightly, looking for any reason to escalate the situation. "And do you live around here?" Mills pressed. "No," the man said simply. "Then why are you here?" Mills' voice was hard now, his patience waning. "I just told you," the man responded, a faint edge of frustration creeping into his tone. "I'm here to pick up my daughter. She's visiting a friend." Mills's jaw clenched as he pulled out his notepad. "License and registration," he ordered. The man didn't move immediately. His dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but his posture remained composed. "Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" he asked, his voice measured. The question was enough to send a wave of annoyance through Mills. Who did this man think he was, questioning him like that? He stepped closer to the window, looming over the car. "I asked for your license and registration," Mills repeated, his voice colder, more commanding. The man slowly reached into the glove compartment and pulled out his paperwork, passing it over to Mills without a word. As the officer inspected the documents, he couldn't help but feel more irritated. Everything seemed in order, and yet there was something about this man that bothered him deeply. Mills couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it gnawed at him, an irrational sense of superiority mixing with his discomfort. He glanced back at the man's ID and his eyes stopped on the name, General Marcus Taylor. Mills froze for a second, his mind trying to catch up with what he was seeing. U.S. Army General? His eyes flicked to the military sticker on the back of the car again. This wasn't just any civilian, but the hesitation was fleeting, and Mills made a conscious decision to ignore the rank for a moment. "Stay in the vehicle," Mills ordered, his voice clipped, as he walked back to his patrol car to run a check on the ID. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, some kind of criminal record, an expired registration, anything that would justify why he was pushing this interaction so far. But when the results came back clean, his frustration only deepened. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this black man, sitting in his expensive sedan in a predominantly white neighborhood, didn't belong here. When he returned to the window, Mills leaned in closer. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he ordered, his voice low but filled with authority. General Taylor's brow furrowed behind his sunglasses. "Excuse me?" he asked, his calm exterior showing the first hint of irritation. "You heard me. Step out of the vehicle," Mills repeated, placing his hand on the holster of his gun as a silent threat. For a moment, General Taylor didn't move. Then, with deliberate slowness, he removed his sunglasses and turned his eyes directly on Mills. There was no fear in his gaze, only cold calculation. "What is this about, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but now sharpened with authority. Mills's pulse quickened, but he didn't back down. "You're acting suspicious. I need to make sure everything's in order." General Taylor didn't move for another long moment. Then finally he opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, standing tall, taller than Mills had anticipated. The man's presence was commanding, and it only made Mills feel more out of control. But before the officer could say another word, a second car pulled up behind the patrol vehicle. The doors opened, and two men in dark suits stepped out quickly. They moved with a sense of urgency, and when they approached, Mills felt the first flutter of uncertainty creep into his chest. "General Taylor," one of the men said, his voice brisk but respectful. "Is everything all right, sir?" Mills's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. These men weren't ordinary civilians. They were military security, part of General Taylor's protection detail. Mills's stomach dropped. The general glanced at the two men, then back at Mills, his expression unreadable. "There seems to be some misunderstanding here," he said, his voice smooth but laced with tension. One of the security men stepped forward, his face tight with barely restrained anger as he addressed Mills. "Officer, this is a decorated U.S. Army general. I suggest you release him immediately before you find yourself in serious trouble." Mills stammered, his mind scrambling to come up with an explanation, but he couldn't find the words. He was trapped in his own web of assumptions and racism, and now he was paying the price. Sergeant Mills stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to regain control of the situation. But this wasn't any ordinary stop, and he knew it now. His heart pounded in his chest as the reality sank in. He had crossed a line, and there was no easy way to step back. The general, now standing tall in front of him, exuded a quiet confidence. He didn't have to raise his voice or puff up his chest. His very presence was enough to remind everyone of the power he held, a power that far outweighed Mills' badge. Mills could feel the gaze of the two security agents boring into him, waiting for him to make his next move. His hand still hovered near his holstered gun, but it felt like a foolish gesture now. The taller of the two agents stepped even closer, his eyes dark with fury. "Release him. Now." The words weren't a suggestion. They were a command. For a moment, Mills considered pushing back, clinging to whatever authority he had left in the situation. He could arrest General Taylor, claim that he resisted or acted suspiciously. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Mills realized how thin that lie would be. He'd already dug himself deep enough. With shaking hands, Mills handed back the general's license and registration. "You're free to go," he muttered, barely able to meet the general's eyes. General Taylor took the documents without a word. "They'll pay," but there was a coldness in his gaze that sent a chill down Mills's spine. Without saying anything further, Taylor turned and got back into his vehicle. The two agents followed, positioning themselves by the car, watching as Mills slunk back to his patrol car, defeated. As Mills slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, his fingers clenched around the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't shake the anger boiling inside of him. Anger not just at General Taylor, but at himself. He knew he had messed up, but part of him still felt that Taylor had somehow disrespected him by not bowing to his authority, by not being afraid. But as the general's sedan pulled away and the agents followed, Mills was left alone on the quiet street with nothing but his thoughts. The adrenaline slowly drained from his body, replaced with a gnawing anxiety. He turned the key in the ignition and drove away, but the pit in his stomach told him that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next day, Mills sat in his patrol car, parked in the station's lot, staring blankly at the dashboard. His phone buzzed repeatedly, but he ignored it, unable to face the messages flooding in from the department. He'd barely slept the night before, the events on Pinecrest replaying over and over in his head. He told himself again and again that he was just doing his job, that he wasn't at fault. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw General Taylor's unflinching stare, and it sent a fresh wave of shame through him. His internal struggle was interrupted by the sharp rap of knuckles on his window. Mills jerked in his seat and looked up to see Captain Stevens, his commanding officer, standing by the car. Stevens was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a graying mustache and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that made every officer in the precinct walk on eggshells around him. Mills rolled down the window, forcing a smile. "Morning, Captain." Stevens didn't return the smile. "Get inside, now." The tone of his voice sent a chill down Mills' spine. This wasn't just a routine conversation. Mills quickly turned off the car and followed Stevens into the station, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, the air felt thick with tension. Officers glanced at him as he walked by, their faces tight, their eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before: disdain. Mills' mouth went dry as he followed Stevens into his office and closed the door behind them. Stevens turned to face him, his arms crossed over his chest. "What the hell happened yesterday, Mills?" Mills swallowed hard. He tried to keep his voice steady, but it trembled slightly. "It was a routine stop, sir. Suspicious vehicle in a neighborhood." "Don't give me that," Stevens snapped, cutting him off. "We both know this wasn't a routine stop. Do you have any idea who that man was?" Mills looked down at his shoes. "Yes, sir. I know now." Stevens let out a bitter laugh. "You knew during the stop, Mills. You saw his ID, saw the bumper sticker. He's a goddamn general in the United States Army, a 4-star general." Mills clenched his fists at his sides, a mix of anger and fear swirling in his gut. "I didn't know it was going to be a big deal." "Not a big deal?" Stevens cut him off again, his voice rising. "The man you harassed has a direct line to the Secretary of Defense. Do you have any idea how far this could go?" Mills opened his mouth to protest, but Stevens wasn't finished. "General Taylor filed a formal complaint last night. His security detail backed him up. This is a public relations nightmare for us, Mills. You've put the whole department in the crosshairs." Mills's heart sank. He had hoped the general would let it go, that he'd brush off the incident and move on. But now it was clear that wasn't going to happen. Stevens stepped closer, his face tight with frustration. "There's already talk of an investigation. Internal affairs is involved, and if this goes higher, we could be looking at national attention, racial profiling, police misconduct. It's all on the table." Mills's head spun. National attention? He hadn't anticipated that this would escalate so quickly, or that the consequences would come down on him with such force. "What do I do, sir?" Mills asked, his voice barely a whisper. Stevens shook his head. "There's not much you can do. The brass is furious. You'll be suspended while the investigation runs its course. If you're lucky, you'll come out of this with your badge, but don't count on it." Mills felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. He had worked his entire career to get where he was, and now it was slipping through his fingers. All because of one encounter, one moment of poor judgment. Stevens sighed heavily and placed a hand on Mills's shoulder. "Look, I don't like this any more than you do, but you brought this on yourself. You need to take some time and think about how you're going to handle this, because the media is going to have a field day with it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mills nodded numbly, unable to find the words to respond. He turned and left the office, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. As he walked through the station, he could feel the stares of his colleagues following him. There were no more friendly nods, no casual greetings. Instead, there was only cold silence, the kind that made his skin crawl. Mills had become a pariah in his own department, and he knew it. By the time Mills got home that evening, the story had already hit the news. He stared at the television in disbelief as his face flashed across the screen, his name linked to the words, racial profiling, and police misconduct. The news anchor was detailing the incident with a precision that made Mills's stomach churn. Sergeant Frank Mills of the Cedar Grove Police Department has been placed on administrative leave following an incident involving U.S. Army General Marcus Taylor, the anchor said, her tone professional but cold. The general, a highly decorated officer, was reportedly harassed by Mills during what was described as a routine traffic stop. The incident has sparked outrage in the local community, with many calling for a full investigation into the police department's handling of the situation. Mills muted the television, his hands trembling. He had known this was coming, but seeing it laid out in front of him made it all the more real. The media had picked up the story, and there was no stopping it now. His face would be plastered across every news outlet, his name synonymous with racism and abuse of power. Sergeant Frank Mills sat on the edge of his couch, his face bathed in the blue glow of the muted television. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and exhaustion was pulling at his eyelids, but every time he closed them, the weight of what was happening crushed him awake again. He couldn't escape the image of General Taylor's composed face, or the memory of those two agents who had humiliated him in a matter of seconds. The news stories kept coming. The public outrage was growing, fueled by social media, where videos, photos, and articles about the incident were spreading like wildfire. Hashtags like Justice for Taylor and End Police Racism were trending nationally. In every corner of the internet, there were discussions about systemic racism in policing, racial profiling, and how Mills had become the latest face of that very problem. He picked up his phone, scrolling through messages from friends and family. Most of them offered hollow words of support, though Mills could tell from the tone that many of them were distancing themselves. A few fellow officers had sent messages like, "Stay strong," or "You did nothing wrong," but it felt empty. He knew better. He had crossed a line, and he wasn't sure if there was any coming back from it. Just as Mills was about to throw his phone down in frustration, it buzzed with a new message from Internal Affairs. Mills's heart stopped. He clicked it open, reading the terse notice. Sergeant Mills, you are requested to appear for a formal interview regarding the incident with General Marcus Taylor. The interview will take place tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the IA office. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination. His fingers tightened around the phone, and for a moment he considered throwing it across the room. But he couldn't. Mills knew that every move he made from here on out would be scrutinized. He wasn't just facing internal affairs. He was facing the court of public opinion, and the whole country seemed to be watching. The following morning, Mills found himself sitting in a small, sterile room in the Internal Affairs office. The walls were a bland shade of beige, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. Across from him sat two investigators, a man and a woman, both of whom regarded him with cold, clinical expressions. The man, Officer Barrett, leaned forward and cleared his throat. "Sergeant Mills, we're going to ask you to walk us through the events of 2 days ago, starting with the moment you arrived on Pinecrest Avenue. Please be as detailed as possible." Mills nodded stiffly. His palms were sweating, and he rubbed them against his pants under the table, trying to compose himself. He took a deep breath and began recounting the story, carefully avoiding any mention of his personal feelings during the stop. He described how he had approached the car, asked for the general's identification, and followed what he claimed were standard procedures. But as he spoke, the room felt like it was closing in on him. His words sounded hollow, even to himself, and he could see that neither investigator was buying what he was selling. They sat in silence as Mills finished, their expressions giving nothing away. When he stopped talking, the woman, Investigator Hanley, adjusted her glasses and spoke for the first time. "Sergeant Mills, we've reviewed the body camera footage from your patrol car, as well as the statements from General Taylor and his security detail." Mills's stomach dropped. He had forgotten about the body camera. In his rush to maintain control during the stop, he hadn't even thought about it, recording every word, every moment. Hanley's gaze sharpened. "It's clear from the footage that you escalated the situation without cause. General Taylor was cooperative, and yet you chose to treat him with hostility. Can you explain why?" Mills felt his mouth go dry. His mind raced, searching for an excuse, for any justification that could make this all seem like a misunderstanding. But the footage didn't lie, and he knew it. He was cornered. I was just trying to do my job, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Barrett exchanged a glance with Hanley before leaning forward again. Sergeant, this isn't just about doing your job. This is about why you felt the need to single out General Taylor. We're dealing with a case of racial profiling here, and if we're going to avoid a full-blown scandal, we need answers. Mills swallowed hard. His mind flashed back to the moment he'd seen Taylor in the car, his initial gut reaction of suspicion and distrust. It was like a reflex, an instinct that he hadn't even questioned in the moment, and now it was coming back to destroy him. I didn't. Mills started, but his voice faltered. He couldn't even bring himself to finish the sentence. The truth was too close, and he couldn't deny it anymore. The room fell into a suffocating silence as Mills lowered his head, unable to meet the investigator's eyes. Meanwhile, across town, General Marcus Taylor sat in his office at the Pentagon, reviewing the latest reports from his subordinates. His phone buzzed beside him, but he didn't reach for it immediately. His mind was still replaying the incident from 2 days ago, a constant loop of frustration and disgust. As a black man who had served his country for decades, rising to the rank of a 4-star general, Taylor had seen his fair share of discrimination. He had fought tooth and nail to earn the respect of his peers, proving himself over and over again. But that day on Pinecrest Avenue had been a harsh reminder that, in the eyes of some, his uniform didn't matter. His service didn't matter. To Sergeant Mills, he had been just another black man in a nice car, suspicious by default. Taylor clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He had remained calm during the encounter, but beneath that calm exterior had been a storm of anger. He wasn't the type to let things go quietly. Not when they were unjust. His phone buzzed again, and this time he picked it up. It was his assistant, informing him of an upcoming meeting with the Chief of Staff. Taylor sighed and leaned back in his chair, the weight of his military responsibilities pressing down on him. But no matter how many reports he read or meetings he attended, the sting of what had happened wouldn't fade. He had been harassed by an officer of the law, someone who was supposed to protect citizens, not target them based on the color of their skin. And now, the country was watching. Taylor knew the implications of this case went far beyond him. It was part of a much larger conversation about race, authority, and power in America. And so, despite the exhaustion that tugged at him, Taylor made a decision. He wouldn't let this go quietly. This wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. This was about all the people who didn't have the platform or the rank to make their voices heard. If it took his story to force some change, then so be it. Taylor picked up his phone again, this time dialing a number that would set the next steps in motion. In the days that followed, the incident between Sergeant Mills and General Taylor grew into a full-blown national controversy. News outlets were running non-stop coverage, analyzing the body camera footage and interviewing experts on racial profiling in law enforcement. Protesters gathered outside the Cedar Grove Police Department, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace," and "Black Lives Matter." General Taylor, despite his preference for privacy, made a public statement during a press conference, standing tall in his military uniform as cameras flashed around him. "This is not just about me," Taylor said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about a system that continues to allow discrimination and racial profiling to persist, even against those of us who have served our country. I expect accountability, not just for me, but for everyone who faces this kind of treatment every day." His words reverberated across the nation. In Congress, lawmakers debated police reform bills, reigniting discussions about systemic racism. Civil rights organizations demanded an overhaul of police training programs. For a moment, it seemed as though the country was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. As for Sergeant Mills, his suspension quickly turned into a formal termination following the conclusion of the internal affairs investigation. The department, desperate to distance itself from the fallout, made it clear that Mills had acted outside of protocol, and his actions would not be tolerated. Mills's career was over. The badge he had once worn with pride had become a symbol of disgrace. He He retreated into obscurity, drowning in his own regret and bitterness. But for General Marcus Taylor, the consequences of the incident were not just personal. They were part of a larger fight for justice and equality, a fight he had no intention of abandoning. Months passed, but the memory of the incident on Pinecrest Avenue lingered in the minds of the American public. General Taylor continued to use his platform to advocate for reforms in law enforcement, pushing for greater accountability and transparency within police departments across the country. His voice became a rallying cry for those demanding change, and his story became a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Meanwhile, cities across the U.S. began implementing new policies aimed at curbing racial profiling. Some police departments introduced mandatory anti-bias training, while others adopted stricter measures for handling complaints of misconduct. The road ahead was long and difficult, but the conversation had begun, and it wasn't going away. For General Taylor, the events of that day had forever changed his life, not just as a military officer, but as a black man living in America. He had faced down an abuse of power and emerged on the other side, determined to fight for a better future for those who couldn't always fight for themselves. And in the end, that was what mattered most. If you liked this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hope to see you in the next video.